We'd won a revolution, but were we truly a nation? Well, honestly, we still had a ways to go. We liked the term United States of America, but mostly what we'd been united in was our desire to overthrow the king. As a young nation, we knew we wanted to have a republic, not royal rule. In other words, we wanted the people to choose their leaders. By the end of the war, all the new states had their own constitutions. All were republics, but they varied in structure. Some were two-house legislatures, but Pennsylvania had just a legislature. No Senate, no governor. There were changes to society. Continuing the idea of religious freedom, Virginia got rid of their official church, and more men were given the right to vote and to serve in office. Question: if middle and lower class people can vote and run for office, how might that change government? For women and African Americans, there was not so much change. Women got some access to education, but real reform was limited. But already, regional differences were rising. In the North, there was the beginning of a movement to free the slaves. The new government was very weak. It was called the Articles of Confederation. Each state was basically its own little country. Well, that makes some sense then. They had just fought to defeat a tyrannical king and didn't want any one state to have too much power. But how would that work if all 50 of our states were separate countries today? The biggest failure that Congress had was in economic areas. Congress couldn't tax. One state could tax trade with another, and many states started issuing their own currency. Things came to a head with Shays' Rebellion. Basically, farmers wanted their state governments to print up lots of money. This would make it easier for the farmers to pay their debts because of rising inflation. But wealthy bankers wanted deflation so that the farmers would find it harder and harder to pay their debts. Daniel Shay led 1,200 people in a rebellion, basically to be treated better by the banks. Kind of puts that Occupy Wall Street in a better perspective. Since the federal government couldn't tax, the state was on their own. But the wealthy bankers raised an army and defeated the rebels quickly. Most of the rebels were either pardoned or ran off to Vermont, which was sort of an independent free state at the time. Shays' Rebellion scared the conservative landowners in America. Really rebellious guys like John Hancock and Jefferson weren't bothered. Jefferson said that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is the natural manure. Both witty and rebellious, that Jefferson. But there was a group of wealthy, powerful men who were ready to trade some freedom for financial security. The men who made up the Constitutional Convention were much less rebellious than the Declaration signers, but they had some details to iron out. Like, should every state be equal, like its own small country? Or should the will of the people decide? What if you lived in Virginia or Massachusetts, two states with lots of people? What if you lived in little Rhode Island? The result was the Great, or Connecticut, Compromise. We'd have a Senate where each state gets 2 votes, and a House where you get a number of votes based on your state size. But if population counted for representation, should slaves count for the population? If you lived in Massachusetts where there were few slaves, what would you think? How about Virginia? The result was the 3/5 Compromise, in which a slave counted as 3/5 of a person for counting, for representation, and taxation. How would this 3/5 Compromise help Virginia? How would it hurt Virginia? Some goals of the Constitution were limited government. Remember that pesky English king? So we'd incorporate popular sovereignty or rule by the people. But remember those small states and how they didn't like a strong central government? Well, we'd have federalism, so the states will have some power. And instead of a king having all the power, we'd have separation of powers. Supporting the ideas of our limited government is a system of checks and balances. Do you know what the president can do if he doesn't like a law that Congress has passed? He can veto the law. Our government has tons of systems like this in place. So we've got an idea of what our government should look like. What if we want to change the way it works? We call that amending it. But the founders made it hard to change the Constitution. It takes 2/3 of Congress to propose an amendment and 3/4 of the states to approve it. Since it's hard to do, it has only happened 27 times. Does this mean the Constitution's perfect? Of course, what would happen if it were really easy to change the Constitution? Give that some thought. Well, most of the delegates supported the plan. Now we needed to ratify it or get it approved by the states. The trick here was to convince the less wealthy people to support it. Most of the wealthy states voted for it quickly. They really wanted security for their trade and economy. But smaller states or less wealthy states, like North Carolina and Rhode Island, held out for a Bill of Rights. And finally, with their support, the Constitution was passed.